piece when it came to the Old Bays department and how it was sort of outgrowing the rest of that department, creating a singular department focused on our energy security and our drive to decarbonise. And, you know, we've got a very good story to tell when it comes to the previous government's record on improving our energy security and indeed driving us towards net zero. We built the first to fifth largest offshore wind farms in the world, producing power on the grid right now. We decarbonise faster than any other G7 nation, halving our carbon emissions from 1992 levels. And indeed, we had plans to increase our nuclear generating capacity to 25% of the UK's overall electricity demand by 2050. That would be 24 gigawatts of power. And so all of that was very good and very proud of it, and the very small role that I had to play in the 2 years that I held office in that department. But obviously, we still face huge challenges. The UK's energy security is still at risk. We are still far too reliant on imports. I have huge concern over this incredible rush towards renewables at any price, and what that will mean in terms of our reliance on China, for example, when it comes to the manufacturing and the sourcing of the critical minerals that will be needed in either batteries or indeed in the vast new solar farms that are going to be built. And that is why I think that we in opposition have to make the case for a slightly nuanced transition when it comes to decarbonising and indeed ensuring our energy security. If I start with nuclear, which was my responsibility in the department before the election, there has been, and it's been recognised by the industry, the sense that the foot has come off the gas with this new government when it comes to nuclear power. They have been reluctant, for example, to give a final investment decision on Sizewell C. There has been slowing down of the competition for the down selection of small modular reactor technologies, which we would have hoped to have made a decision on by now. And it's quite clear that if we want to increase our energy security and if we want to drive towards a cleaner energy future, more nuclear needs to be a part of that. So, as I said, 24 gigawatts by 2050 would have been 3 gigawatt scale reactors, Hinkley, Sizewell, and another probably built at Wilfa, which I was on my way to announce the day that the Prime Minister decided to call the election. I was on a train to North Wales and then told to get back on a train and come back from North Wales. I was like, in this rain? Anyway, it was so that never actually got final approval, and I don't think the current government have actually signalled their intention for that site. And there would have been, obviously, small modular reactors in the mix, which would have taken us to 24 gigawatts. So we'd like to see more emphasis on nuclear. I think we need to return to maximum economic recovery when it comes to our own North Sea oil and gas. 45% of the gas used in the UK comes from the North Sea. That will obviously decline. The North Sea is a declining basin, but there is no reason that it needs to decline at the speed that is now projected as a result of the decisions being taken by this government when it comes to the increasing and the extending of the energy profits levy, the removal of investment allowances, and other moves. I think if we are singularly the only country in the world with a strategic reserve of fossil fuels in our own waters that seems to be taking policy decisions that will restrict our ability to actually exploit that. And I think that's very strange at a time when we're seeking to increase our own energy security. So whilst we have it, we should be using it, and I think we should be doing what we can to encourage, as I said, maximum economic recovery and ensure more of the fossil fuels in our mix in the UK actually comes from the UK, because we're still going to be using gas. And I'll come on to gas. I know Sandra is here. We're going to be coming on to gas in a minute, but we're still going to be using a substantial amount of gas in our energy systems for the next decades at least. And if we do not maximize what we have, we will be increasing imports from overseas and increasing especially LNG being produced in Qatar and the USA, which does nothing for overall climate goals, let alone for our energy security. I was looking before I came out at some stats when it comes to our reliance on gas, because a lot has been made, as I just said, on the reliance on imports, the declining basin in the North Sea, and indeed the carbon emissions that result from it. And I think that we probably didn't do enough when we were in government to move quicker towards reintroducing hydrogen more into the mix. The village trials, obviously, you cannot proceed where there is not public consent, but the village trials obviously did not proceed at the pace that we needed them to. And I think that has been a problem. I think there is a debate still to be had and yet to be resolved as to what part hydrogen will play in domestic heating, if any. Certainly will have a huge role to play when it comes to industry and the more difficult to decarbonise industries that we are talking about. But what role it will play in the overall gas network, when you've got 73% of houses in the UK still reliant on a gas-fired boiler, and only 50,000 homes last year taking up the opportunity to buy a heat pump of some kind, when the target for 2020 is 600,000, I think we need to have a wider discussion about how we transition away from natural gas using hydrogen. That's a very difficult discussion to have because there is concern in the public, but it's up to the government to sort of lead that debate in a way that we, hands up, probably did not when we were in government. So there's a lot of things to debate and discuss out there. I do think, however, that whilst the current government is talking a good game when it comes to decarbonising and becoming more energy independent and more energy secure, which is all very good, that they do need to look again at their policies specifically in the North Sea, because I do not think that will lead to our being more energy secure. I do think this rush towards renewables at any cost is going to put us more in the hands of China and states from where the critical minerals that are going to be needed are being sourced from. And indeed, I think they need to look very heavily at what we do when it comes to nuclear pace and put more emphasis on that drive moving forward. And of course, there's the hydrogen piece as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion today, actually.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Covered an awful lot there that we'll definitely be able to dig into. So Dara, if I can come to you next. Your organisation obviously represents the entire energy industry. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how business views coming over these challenges and how we can move away from gas and what the sort of issues are created with that, but also the opportunities that might develop.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ned. Thanks, Andrew. I don't know how to follow that, really. It's really comprehensive. So I'll start with just saying a little bit about Energy UK. For those of you who don't know us, we are the trade association representing businesses operating right across the energy industry. I think for me, what that gives us is this really unique view across the whole system and understanding kind of how different bits of the kind of energy industry, which is vast, interact with one another, where there perhaps are tension points and also where we can see kind of fixes. Because you know that if you take action, policy action, any frameworks, any programs, if you intervene in one bit of the market, there are ripples and effects right across the market, and it's really important to recognise that. So whilst you can go heavy on one technology, there is a knock-on effect right across the market. So I think that's kind of a big part of our USP. We represent power generators from all sorts of power generations, so gas, nuclear, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, biomass. And I think talking specifically about gas, right now gas is the main source of flexibility, right? It's the main source of dispatchable power, and it plays a role in maintaining the delicate balance of supply and demand at times where renewables are not providing enough. And that's a big challenge to overcome as part of the government's kind of CP 2030 mission. And the other thing, as Andrew said, it offers security. It provides a third of the UK's electricity. And switching off today would lead to blackouts, and that would be at an enormous cost to the customer, right? And that's the thing we have to always balance. And the reason I raise that is because we represent the suppliers. They're the ones who bill you. They're the ones who have to manage the huge debt mountain. And customers are really, really important. And increasingly, what I'm finding is our conversations about the energy market, regardless of who you're talking to, regardless of what kind of business you're talking to, there's a really new and welcome focus on the customer and communities and citizens and people, because wherever you stand on this, it is widely accepted that the next bit of the energy transition is going to be harder. We have led the way as a country when it comes to decarbonising the power sector. We're expecting the 7th carbon budget this year. And we know that, again, it will focus on buildings and transport as the big key areas that we need to decarbonise. And that means you have to talk to people, right? So we can have these conversations about the system, but that needs to start translating into a conversation about people. And people don't necessarily wake up and think about what the energy mix is. They don't wake up and think about kind of when do I switch something on and off. Like, lives are busy, lives are chaotic. I never, ever come to an event like this without exchanging words with people who I really like about how mad our morning has been. So mine has been, and I have a great job. I get paid well. My husband gets paid well. We have family around to help, but it's really hard. just living life and having kids and managing everything and remembering everything. Who wants to constantly be managing their energy mix in their home? So we need to be thinking a lot about flexibility. We need to be thinking about flexibility at DSR, at home level. We need to be thinking about flexibility in the system. And that's where I'm kind of coming back to the point around it's about the energy mix, it's about infrastructure. We need energy storage. We need to be able to store excess energy. We need to have the infrastructure to move energy around. We need to make sure that it is easier for everyone, homes and businesses, to use energy when it's cheapest and most plentiful on the grid. And I think that's what we should keep coming back to every time we talk about the future of energy in this country, is actually how are we making it easier for our people, for our businesses, for industry to all use energy at its best price, really. So I think that's something I think we should be thinking about. When we talk about kind of the issues with our transition away from gas, there has in the past been a bit of a lack of clarity. And now we've got this 95% target announced last week. It guarantees a role of gas for ensuring security of supply. And so the conversation has to be about how do we do that in the cleanest way possible. And I think that's quite good, right? It kind of focuses the mind a bit. We need to really think about the skills pipeline for all of the amazing work we need to do on building infrastructure and investing in clean energy tech. We need a real strategic effort on the skills piece, I think. And I think it's really important to think about how we do this as part of the government's industrial strategy approach. But also, for us as an industry, we need to be thinking about preparing a workforce. Something I found out recently, which I think is really interesting, is that on the apprenticeship side of things, we have far too many apprenticeships that are aimed at graduates. And the majority of jobs are actually vocational, 16 plus. You don't need to go to university. That's what the bulk of these kind of hundreds of thousands of jobs coming up in the sector are going to be in the coming decade, which I think is huge, huge, important, really, really amazing opportunity for people to have good, well-paid, skilled jobs. And that it's incumbent on us as an industry, I think, to come to the table with a plan for how we're going to work with government on that. We need to make sure that we think about things like capacity market reform, so that flexibility in the mix of technologies, kind of including unabated gas, the balancing mechanism, all of that, how we make sure we can take on board new technologies, batteries, DSR as part of it. And I think we need to think about kind of how the rollout of renewables interacts with all of this. There's a lot riding on AR7, just as there was on AR6. And we need to be really careful about how that does translate into cost to customers. One last thing I'll say is that as an industry, we've wanted ambition. We've wanted clarity and ambition. And this week, we should be getting the Clean Power Action Plan from the government. And I'm really excited to see what's in it and to see what that means for direction of travel, because capital has a choice of location. And it is really, really important that we're thinking about how we make sure the UK is attractive for now and for the long term.
Great, thanks very much, Dara. It was really interesting tying in the demand and the sort of infrastructure side of things there. So Daisy, on to you next. You've been looking into, I guess, how we move away from gas as well, but also some of the challenges that creates in terms of the supply chain. We've already heard China mentioned. Maybe you can dig a little bit more into that for us and think about how we tackle those sort of dual challenges.
Absolutely, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name's Daisy Powell-Chandler, and I run the Energy and Environment practice at Public First. For those of you who haven't come across us, we are a global policy consultancy. So I spend a lot of time helping corporates, NGOs, big organisations think through some of the big policy transformation that we're going through at the moment. And that includes how on earth we're going to hit net zero, but also some of the big problems that creates and also unlocks along the way. And I think when we talk about coming off gas and energy security, it's important to think about why and what that means. So we need to come off gas, partly because burning it causes the release of a lot of carbon, but also partly because it's not very efficient. When you burn gas, you create a lot of heat, and in many situations that isn't harnessed. So we're about to use a lot more energy. Great economies, growing economies use a lot of energy, and the most efficient way to do that is usually, these days, through electrifying. So what are we trying to replace? These are slightly odd figures, so forgive me, and I'm horribly oversimplifying here, but about a third of our gas goes on creating energy generation. How are we going to replace that? Well, we're mostly, you've already heard from our other speakers, but we're mostly going to be replacing that with renewables and some nuclear. And we know how to do that, but we need to get better at building it. So the problems there are largely around planning and around that community consent. Then we also need to unlock some innovation in storage. Now, I feel pretty confident about that because I'd say we're about 85% there towards unlocking some of that. There's a bit more innovation that we need to do, but there's a whole bunch of things we were panicking about 3 years ago that we've already solved. So I think we're going to be fine with that. And I think up to 95%, we really are going to be fine. And then working out how we use gas as a strategic reserve is sort of a policy problem that we all need to work on over the next few years. Then there's a third that we use for industrial processes. We use gas as a feedstock, or we use it as a source of heat. And a bunch of those we're going to solve by electrifying them. That means a whole load more infrastructure. So we're back to how do we build stuff and how do we get consent. But there's also some more innovation. There's a bunch of processes we don't yet know how we're going to create the right power source for them. That might be by getting better at industrial heat. It might be small modular reactors, but we're still working on that. And I'd say that's something that I know a lot of people are going to be thinking about this year and next year. And then the final third is domestic. We're using gas in our homes to cook and to heat ourselves. This one is really tricky because some of this is tricky because we need to build more transmission and more storage. But actually, mostly we know how we're going to do it. We just need to do it. The bigger problem here is cultural, and we don't spend enough time thinking about this. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the practicalities, but actually there's a real problem here, which is that the gas transition, the transition from burning coal and wood to gas, widely seen as a great success. It took us 5 decades and we haven't finished it yet. So if you want to move everyone onto electric heating, we're going to have to get really good at cultural change very quickly. And that means making it easy, cheap, and desirable. It probably means flipping how we think about these things. Up until now, we've thought of off-gas grid homes as like the awkward last rump. And we thought, well, they'll be the ones we leave till last. Actually, arguably, they're the ones who haven't recently been through a heat transition. They got left behind in the last one. They might be the most welcoming of new tech that's going to make their homes more comfortable and cheaper to heat. And actually, it's probably going to involve a lot more devolution because the context of the heat transitions that our communities have gone through all over this country over the last 5 decades is so different that actually we're going to need to approach our communities very differently if we want to get them into electrified heat. And so that's going to mean more granular approaches, and that means devolving power down, which is really hard when the urge, when you want to go fast, is to centralize. So that's how we're going to do it domestically, but you've already heard China mentioned. It seems to be this year's C word. You can't have a conversation about this without talking about China. We talk a lot about, we need to disentangle ourselves, we need to get ourselves off China's supply chains. First of all, that's not going to happen. There's no way right now we're completely detaching ourselves from China's supply chains. That's partly because they've played an absolute blinder, but it's also because actually we want to build this stuff and right now they're selling it really cheaply. We should be buying all of their lovely cheap solar panels and we should be installing them because solar panels are really cheap right now and they produce really cheap power. Do we also, I think there is a question about whether we really do want to fully disentangle ourselves from China. In general, when you've got a fast rising global power, locking them off from the rest of the world is a recipe for disaster and past dependency towards war. And do you know what's really bad for climate change? War. So let's not do that. I would argue it makes quite a lot of sense to say, in some ways, quite closely entangled with China. But we do need to be pragmatic about building up our own areas of strength. And that in part means harking back to some of the real strengths that we've had historically in chemical processing and being the middle part in a chain within a network of allies who are all working to create different strengths in supply chains. And finally, I would say that we are going to have to really rethink the way in which that we are working with the global south, who I don't think we have mentioned yet today. But one of the reasons why China has been so capable of locking down these supply chains is because they're quite often the only ones turning up with gifts. They're the ones who turn up and say, here is a real offer with jobs and investment, and we're going to help you do this thing, and we're going to buy all of this off you once we've built the mine. And that is not how we present when we turn up to those countries. And right now, the Global South are not only saying we're not helping them enough to mitigate climate change, we're not cutting back our own carbon, we're not helping them to adapt to the huge impacts that they're already seeing, but we're also not helping them to make any money out of this transition. So we need to come up with a real offer for the global south, and we need to do it quickly.
Great, thanks, Daisy. I think really important points about the sort of international elements of what we need to do in order to improve energy security. And Jess, finally on to you. We heard a little bit about some of the sort of cultural elements, the demand side there, and we've done a lot of work on how some of the new technologies can help us to reduce our imports of energy and help to improve security. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jess Ralston. I'm from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. We're a group of independent analysts who assess and offer insights on politics and policy surrounding energy and climate change. So yes, I was going to talk quite a bit about demand, but I also just wanted to mention one thing about the North Sea, and that's no matter how much gas we get out of it, we'll never control the price of gas. So the last few years, obviously, anyone who's paid a gas bill has known the price of reliance on gas. And although at the moment, around 50% of the UK's overall gas use, so that's from industry, for houses, for anything that uses gas, 50% at the moment comes from the North Sea. That is going to fall because the North Sea, as you said, Andrew, is a declining basin. And actually, the difference that a moratorium on new drilling makes to that decline is very, very minor. We actually did some research which showed that the difference in decline can actually be made up by one large wind farm. That's how much we're talking about difference in the moratorium versus not a moratorium. So I think the price of gas has been the issue over the past few years, and I know Dara might disagree considering there was a lot of supply concerns, but the price has been the issue for the consumer and will continue to be. So I think on the North Sea, it's declining and we have to accept that fact. And because it's declining, unless we want to just buy in more and more gas from abroad, we need to reduce our demand for that gas. And that comes from things like energy efficiency in homes. So as everyone will probably know, our houses are in a pretty poor state. There's not really been much progress on energy efficiency over the past decade or so. And that's for various reasons. Part of that is policy, and policy not really being well designed for the masses, for the mass market. But there's also a lack of interest from the consumer around energy efficiency, and making sure that everybody knows what they can do to improve their energy efficiency is sometimes quite difficult because it's a very complex thing. Every house is different. And it's not easy to go into someone's house and say you need to spend loads of money and make loads of changes. But in the long run, that is beneficial for not only the consumer, because their bills will be lower, but also for the UK as a whole, because we are less dependent on that gas, which will increasingly come from abroad. So energy efficiency, I think, is a key thing which isn't really talked about. Well, it is talked about, but we should be talking about it more. We should be sorting out not only existing homes, but new homes, because at the moment, new homes are being built which will require retrofit later on. And the government might be about to delay the future home standards due to various issues in the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, I think they are now. But a delay to the future home standard just means more homes being built that need to be retrofitted later. And it's a real shame if that happens, because we've been waiting for new home standards for about 10 years. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But then on the issue of existing homes as well, there's a lot of energy efficiency schemes out there, but their eligibility criteria is quite narrow. And it would be good to see a more mass market solution come from the government, who obviously have been saying that they're going to reduce energy bills. They want to get things sorted around climate change, and they also want to improve our energy security. And insulation is really important for that. And I know a few other people have already mentioned it, but heat pumps as well are a crucial technology. And at the moment, we have a really large domestic boiler industry. So 1.8 million boilers a year are installed in the UK. A lot of them are made in the UK because we have a long history of gas from the North Sea. We've got gas boiler manufacturers here. They do export some, but the domestic market is really big. And that's an opportunity, right? So if we know there's 20 million heat pumps installed across Europe already, why aren't we making some of them? Why aren't we exporting them? Why are we relying on cheaper ones from China when we have the domestic ability to make boilers, which actually are not that different from heat pumps? So I think heat pumps represent a real opportunity as well, not just for reducing our gas demand and getting that energy security, but also for our businesses and making sure that not only the manufacturers, but also the installers are ready for the next thing, which is going to be heat pumps.
Great, thanks, Jess. I think definitely, important points around getting the policy right to help encourage more people to thinking about how to make their homes sort of more efficient and decarbonise them as well. Right, we'll move to audience questions very shortly, so get prepared. But I wanted to ask one question myself first of all, and to start with you, Andrew, on this one, and then I'll see if anybody else wants to come in on it. You mentioned the sort of importance of not just doing renewables at any price, but also looking to expand nuclear, and obviously our current nuclear projects are likely to provide very expensive electricity. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we try and overcome those challenges.
I disagree. I don't think nuclear projects actually deliver more expensive electricity. If you look at Finland, where their average energy bill is 70% less than it is in the UK as a result of being so reliant on nuclear, I think, as Jess said, it's actually been the UK's over-reliance on the very fluctuative and recently very high gas prices led to very high energy prices here. If you compare us to France, Finland, and other countries who have got a predominantly nuclear powered grid, then it is a very different story altogether. The problem with nuclear is the front loading. It's the cost of building the nuclear power plants in the first place that adds the cost. So I think that our way towards cheaper energy prices is yes. More renewables. We all agree we need to build more renewables. That's why we have began the CFD process, moved towards annual auction rounds, delivered the first 5th largest offshore wind farms in the UK. We're proceeding with many other projects and new technologies. And indeed, we're moving towards increasing our nuclear generating capacity following a decade of not investing enough time or indeed money in that. All of that will lead towards a reduction in reliance on imports, moving towards a post-fossil fuel reliant grid, and indeed to cheaper prices. So that's how we get there. I think it's a combination of all the above. There were so many interesting things said by so many. I was taking notes as everybody was speaking. There was a few things. Skills, I think, is really important. We're not going to do any of this unless we get the skilled workforce. When I was in government, there was a projection that the skilled workforce that we need is 250,000 additionally trained workers than where we are right now. That's to deliver all the energy projects. That's not just one of the sectors. But that's a hell of a lot of people to create from nowhere. We do not have the number of people doing STEM subjects at college or university, or indeed people coming out of school looking to get into these energy projects at the minute. So that's going to take a huge effort from government and industry and academia to get all those people building, because without them, we're not going to do it. Supply chain was mentioned. This is a global race. We tend to have this discussion, and really good discussions they are, in rooms like this and within government and out with government and in the press in this country, thinking a very sort of the island mentality of the great British, how we decarbonise in the UK. Actually, this is a global race, and every country in Europe and indeed across most of the world is in a race to decarbonise, and we're all chasing the same finite resources in an effort to do that. So building up our own domestic capability, building up our own supply chain, building up our own manufacturing base, that's something that we were seeking to do, and I know that the current UK government is seeking to do as well. There will be no difference between the parties on that. So if we aren't able to do that, then we're not going to deliver. Talks about planning and consenting. One of the biggest issues I think we've had was the fact, and I've said this publicly before, when we brought forward and legislated for net zero by 2050, we never really engaged with a conversation with the British public about what that will actually mean, the changes that they will have to make to how they live their lives, how the landscape in which they live will change as a result of the policy decisions that will need to be taken to get to net zero by 2050. It's a conversation. Net zero is incredibly popular. I think it still gets 72% support in the country today, far and above any support for any political party or any other policy that's being proffered. But when or even beyond that, absolutely. But when it comes to people changing how they live their lives or taking decisions that might impact on how they make their lives, or the disruption that they might have to endure when they choose to install, for example, a heat pump, or allow for pylons to be built across the landscape where they live, then that's a very different conversation altogether. So that's a conversation we're going to need to have as well. Daisy mentioned more devolution. As a Scottish Conservative, I kind of gulped very loudly when she said that. I'm going to finish up in 2 seconds. Auction rounds. There is a concern the auction rounds are going to become less competitive. One of the really important elements to the CFD process was ensuring that we got a balance between delivering the renewable projects that we need at a cost that was acceptable to bill payers. I do worry that as we rush towards these increasingly ambitious targets, the competitive element of the auction rounds, it may fall away, and that will lead to a poor deal for bill payers in the long run. Now, AR5 was not, I don't think, the government's finest hour. It didn't result, as I'm sure many people in this room know, but there is a middle ground to be sought, I think, in between where we are headed and where we were when we came to auction round 5. And when it comes to storage, absolutely we need to increase our storage capability here in the United Kingdom. That will be a mixture of building new battery storage facilities, increasing our gas. It's very concerning that Centrica have decided that they're going to be closing part of the Rough storage facility here in the UK. I think that will have an impact on our energy security moving forward. And indeed, investing in pumped hydro storage in Scotland, for example, all of which will lead to better storage facilities and an increase in our energy security. That's not an answer to your question, but it is a sort of a summation of the points everybody was making.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for starting to answer my question and then answering lots of other issues as well. It's very, very helpful. Thank you. Right, so we'll go to audience questions now. A few things. If you could please just raise your hands. If you could say your name and where you're from to start with, and if I could just make a request to please make sure that you ask a question and keep any lead in as brief as possible, that would be great. So. Lucy, if you can come, the one on the sort of third row back to start with, and then I'll take a few. Lucy's just going with the microphone at the moment. Yeah. If we go third row, and then we can go second row, and then we can go first row, so make it simple.
Hey, my name's Dharmesh. I'm a market advisor called Beringa. I also used to work at DESNZ, which the minister knows. I'll keep it short. So the CFD regime, the more renewables you build, the more it subsidizes renewables. That's because the more wind farms you have, the lower the market price when the wind is blowing, higher the price when it's not. And it socializes the costs of intermittent renewables across the system rather than leaving it with the wind farm developer. So a question, is it time to abolish the CFD regime and allow renewables to be built on a merchant basis, like on the market, and let them compete with other projects?
Thank you. Yeah, so let's go second row. Sorry, there were ones all down the middle here. So we'll go second row and then first row.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Frederick Tida. I'm currently unaffiliated, but incoming with RAND. My question is slightly different. You've touched on China in the supply chain, but I'm also curious in how you would address the energy sector from a position of CNI and especially cybersecurity. Germany recently introduced a law that basically obliges medium to large enterprises to invest more in that and make companies and even CEOs personally liable for the cybersecurity of their businesses. Is that something that you think is probably a little bit too harsh, but is that something you think that we should introduce here? And do you think there are other ways that perhaps we can encourage companies in the energy sector to do more to protect the energy sector from a position of CNI?
Thank you. Jeremy Nicholson from Trio Sustainability and Energy Advisor, and in a previous life, a campaign for energy-intensive industries, some of which are no longer with us, I'm sad to say. Thank you for your remarks, and in particular about the offshoring of production of materials, and indeed some of the difficulties that are arisen there. So we're substituting imports of gas and oil to some extent by importing materials for other forms of generation. That may be a good thing, it might be the right way to go, but it comes with consequences too. But it's not just oil and gas we're importing electricity. Don't get me wrong, interconnection's hugely important, it's part of flexibility, I'm glad we've got it, we need more of it. But the UK, no more than the rest of Europe, can piggyback on spare nuclear capacity in France and hydro capacity in Norway during a cold, dark fortnight in the depths of winter, hence the importance of gas at the moment and presumably some other low-carbon alternative in future. Given the limitation of what can be done on demand response for long duration response and the issues with batteries for days or weeks at a time, what's going to plug that gap? And perhaps should we be looking to other areas of the economy to decarbonise rather than perhaps obsessing too much about squeezing the last 5% out of electricity?
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question on whether we should abolish CFDs. We have a question around cybersecurity issues in the energy sector and how we can get companies to pay more attention to that. And finally, we have plugging the gap on the sort of limitations we have around both importing electricity and the storage capacity that we have. So I don't know whether you want to take them all at once, but Andrew, we'll come to you first, and then we'll go around the rest of the panel.
Very briefly, because I know I spent quite a lot of time answering not answering the last question. But so Darnesh, good to see you. Thank you for the difficult question. Should we abolish CFD? I'm not. That is not the position of the Conservative Party that we should be abolishing contracts for difference. So I'm not going to, change party policy at this moment. But we do have concerns at the increased targets making the current CFD process far less competitive, and the impact that will have on bill payers as a result. So should we be much more cognizant of the market and the impact that the increased subsidy that the renewables industry will be reliant on as a result of the CFDs moving forward? Yes, we should. Are we in the position right now to say let's abolish it? Absolutely not, but it is something that we are looking at intensely at the minute. What is the future model for delivering renewables projects moving forward, and is it the model that we used in the 2015 to 2024 sort of period that it was most successful? I think that's a really interesting discussion to have. China, look, there are questions over cybersecurity, but there are also questions, and these are raised regularly in the House and indeed outside, on whether or not decarbonisation of the UK and Europe should come on the backs of disputed human rights activities in parts of China. That's another issue that we need to look very closely at. There are concerns over the accusations of slave labor being used, for example, in the Xinjiang province to deliver some of the parts of solar panels that are being installed in the UK, and whether or not the solar industry and indeed the UK government and indeed other governments around the world can do more to weed out those practices that would not be acceptable in the UK, Europe, or North America, but somehow are acceptable in China. And should that be the basis on which we move forward, sort of delivering those? But cybersecurity is obviously a huge concern. Took a decision to remove Huawei from infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure in the UK. Should we be looking at doing the same when it comes to our energy infrastructure as well? That's, again, a very important discussion and one that needs to be had. There's a question on interconnectors. Yes, the UK is, reliant on imports of electricity from, for example, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But we are also we do export energy to France. Last December, when quite a few of the French nuclear power plants were down for routine maintenance, we were exporting energy into France, so much so that the Christmas lights on the Champs-Elysees were being kept open as a result of, Macron never mentioned this, as a result of exports of energy. There was never a thank you note going from the UK into Europe. Interconnectors are very important. Again, a really important discussion to be had as to where the decision-making power for new interconnectors should be, because the ambition of the UK government, as it is right now, is to become a net energy exporter. But as it sits right now, it's Ofgem that takes a decision as to whether or not an interconnector actually gets to go ahead or not. So should that decision now rest with ministers, given the strategic importance and energy security importance of interconnectors to our allies, or should it still lie with Ofgem, who take a decision based on the cost to bill payers? Or should it be somewhere in the middle? That's something that we were wrestling with as we came towards the end, as it was, of our time in government, and it's something that the new government, I know, needs to take a decision on right now. So yeah, that's...
Great, thanks, Andrew. Yep, that was brilliant, thank you. Dara, we can come to you next. I imagine you'll have a similar view on CFDs, but perhaps you can say a little bit more about sort of the importance of those, and if you don't think we should abolish them, why not? And also on the what we need to do around sort of long duration storage, as well as more interconnectors potentially to deal with that sort of the flexibility that we need.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned AR5, Andrew, because I wrote down AR5 disappointing. So look, I think I'm glad you raised it. And look, it was disappointing, and I think the reality is that everything was more expensive and still is more expensive, and that's why we needed a bigger budget, right? And in order to procure more, we have to make sure that AR7 is significant enough to unlock and deliver the projects we need it to. Your point about merchant projects I thought was really interesting. Let's not forget, it wasn't that long ago that we were in an energy crisis. Just your point about gas setting the price, and that's why customers were struggling. I absolutely agree with that, and that's exactly why we need to invest in homegrown clean power, so that we're no longer dependent on imported gas and that setting the price. I completely agree with that. We did a really interesting report working with Jess and her team on the energy crisis, and I think that it's really important we don't lose the lessons of that. Just to come back to your point, though, about merchant, let's not forget an a windfall tax, the electricity generators levy, was introduced on merchant projects because it was deemed that they'd profited unfairly or profited in an unreasonable or profited too much. So I think that, there is a question around whether you'd want more merchant projects anyway, because this is about fairness to the customer as well. And at the height of the crisis, actually, the CFDs were paying back to customers. Not loads, but it was a little bit off the bill. And the main thing, I think, if you want to talk about cost to customers, is going to be about policy cost rebalancing. And actually, this much, much bigger conversation about two things. One is, how do you really target support to people who simply cannot afford to pay for the energy that they need to use? And that's a kind of a really big issue when we've got debt sitting at £3.7 billion owed to energy suppliers. And then on the other hand, we are about to invest loads of money in infrastructure and in power generation. That has to be paid for somehow. And that conversation about bill payers versus taxpayers, current customers versus future customers, that's part of this cultural conversation that I think both Andrew, Daisy and Jess have all touched on, which is we aren't very good at talking to people about this, and we do need to get better.
Great, thanks, Nora. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
It's a bit of a speed round. These are all really key questions. Had you worded your question on CFD slightly differently, I would have just said yes. I don't think it's time to abolish CFDs, but it is definitely time for reform. I think there was a moment towards the start of this year where that went from being something that was sort of a slightly niche position to being something that people whispered about on the edges of meetings. And I think we're getting to the point where we're going to start hopefully having some better ideas about what that might mean. That's clearly a broader structural conversation. This isn't just about CFDs. No one has mentioned constraint payments, I don't think. If you're talking about why bills are expensive, you're talking about global gas prices, but you're also talking about the regulatory burden that we put on those nuclear power stations. You're talking about the structure of our power system, which was built for a few very large generation sites and is currently creating extra cost for the consumer because it has not yet adapted to the new world. Some of the answer to that is in better storage solutions, many of which are now developing, but they're taking their time. I would argue more interconnection rather than less is also part of that solution. And I think, we are seeing some really interesting projects come forward that are transcontinental and that bridge some of that. We're less likely to be within the same weather system problem that we see when you talk about Europe. Even with Europe, though, we see even having an hour's time difference between when your peak demand has a really big difference to play in making the interconnectors more useful. So we shouldn't underestimate how useful they can be. And to circle back then to the importance of cybersecurity, it keeps me awake sometimes. I think broadly, if we're thinking about the big threats facing our energy system from foreign actors, it's another gas price shift and the impact that could have on quality of life in this country and our democracy potentially in the longer term, but also the potential for cyber-created blackouts. And those two things sound pretty scary, so we should probably have a plan. And I sort of hope we do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Oh, yeah. There we go. All good.
Thanks, Daisy. Definitely an important point to think about energy security in a sort of more national security sense as well. Jess, I guess you may want to come in on particularly the sort of interconnectors and storage side of things, and then also potentially on the CFDs as well. Maybe then work on both of these areas.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, on CFDs, no, I don't think we should abolish them. I think as Dara mentioned, over the gas crisis, they played a really important role in stabilising electricity prices, and they did pay back a little bit to consumers during that time. I think it's a bit silly that we don't show consumers more how much renewables are doing for their bills, because there's a general attitude that all of this stuff costs loads of money and that all goes on bills, but we don't reflect the fact that renewables are cheaper or comparable to gas when it comes to electricity generation. So I think some of the narrative around renewables doesn't really reflect the reality around the prices. On cybersecurity, I'm in no way an expert, and I'm definitely not qualified to answer this. But I will say I agree with Daisy that it's a much bigger question. Like this cybersecurity and China issue doesn't just affect energy things. It doesn't just affect electric vehicles and solar and heat pumps. It affects everything. I'm sure we've all got mobile phones with bits that were made in China in them. And I think it's a much wider question about what we do to prepare for any sort of issue that we might have in the future. And then I'm aware of time, so quickly on interconnectors. I think we need more interconnectors. We need more long-term storage, like pumped hydro, as Andrew said, pumped hydro, as Andrew said. I think hydrogen, green hydrogen storage is interesting. Tidal lagoons and things like that, haven't really had much progress on them, despite the fact we're an island with lots of tides. So I think there's a lot more that could and should be done on energy storage, because we need a whole swathe of different things to make sure that we can meet net zero in a way that provides energy security.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, so I think we probably have time to fit in 2 more questions if we have some. So, Lucia, I'm going to make it more difficult this time if you do the man at the back in the suit just there. Yeah, and then come right to the front to man in the green jumper.
Thank you. Temi Afolabi from the Nichols Group. I just wanted to pick on the topic of hydrogen very quickly. So I fully understand and appreciate we need an energy mix. And we need every sort of toolbox in the kit as well to ensure that actually we can deliver for people. I just wonder, particularly of the comments you made with regards to different communities and people actually really understanding this and the complexity of what needs to be dealt with, if there is needs to communicate to people a bit more better. But also, secondly, with regards to hydrogen, which at the moment there's lots of uncertainty. If you look at the WIFB project that was cancelled as well due to sort of bad publicity, I wonder if we need to provide more certainty around actually does hydrogen have a role to play? And the reason why I'm asking that question is when you look at the significance of everything that needs to be delivered in a very short time scale, challenging economic climate, supply chain challenges, lack of skilled resource in this space, materials, lots of complexity to deal with. Do we need to be certain in order to improve delivery time skills? So if hydrogen doesn't have a role to play, do we need to confirm that and be very clear about it?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim Clark, freelance consultant, but I used to do a lot of work on sustainability. I want to ask about people, normal people, who aren't experts in net zero and the energy transition. Daisy mentioned the cultural factors. Andrew mentioned that net zero is widely supported. I feel like the consensus around net zero is slipping. You know, Reform are overtly against net zero, and they're doing very well at the moment. So, is there a projection in the medium term of bills actually coming down? Something Labour has spoken about in the past. You know, are we talking 10 years, 15 years? And if we can't offer that to people as a potential carrot in the future, do we just need to be honest with people and say, look, this is going to cost you more, but it's worth it in the long run?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got more communication around hydrogen, but also we need certainty about its role. And then secondly, what's actually going to happen to people's energy bills? And if it's not going to come down sooner, do we need to be honest about that? Daisy, let's start with you.
Yes and yes. Hydrogen. We need so much hydrogen. We need to produce hydrogen in a green manner. We need loads of it. We need to replace a whole load of high heat processes using hydrogen. It's not going into people's homes, and the government should say that. People. People are totally essential to this transition. One of the reasons the government has been able to go so fast in the UK, we're halfway there, everyone. I feel like we just need to keep reminding ourselves we're halfway there, more than halfway at this point. We are halfway there, and we will get the rest of the way. But we do need to bring people with us. And as I said earlier, the way we do that is we make it easy, we make it cheap, and we make it desirable, just as with any other technology. And I think we need to think about people as citizens, and we need to think about them as consumers, and we need to spend less time trying to take them on a journey about net zero and bring them with us and the underlying rationale, because they already buy that. But you can't sell everything as we're going to do this because of net zero. Because as Dara alluded to earlier, they are busy and they are broke and they are concentrating on other things like doing their jobs. And it's really unfair to tell them they need to devolve everything from first principles. So actually, our job as a sector is to make this super easy. It's to come up with the great software solution that makes it easy. It's to make it easy to find the information on how they change over their heating system. It's to offer really clear guidance on what heating system is likely to go into their home. It's to make sure that the zoning is in place if they're going to be part of a heat network, so they know who is handling that and what it's going to involve. It is about making this stuff make their home warmer. It's about making sure that they're insulated if that's what they need. But it's also about talking about this stuff in normal people words. It's about going out there and saying, you won't be allowed to have a gas boiler. That's okay, your gas boiler's got another 10 years on it. This decision is not coming at you anytime soon. But in the meantime, there are going to be heat pumps on EastEnders. And Martin Lewis is going to be talking about this. And you'll be seeing new contracts coming up with your energy providers that allow this to be cheaper. And maybe when you get a new car, someone will talk about how your energy package can help make charging it cheaper. And when you get a second-hand car, it's going to be really clear whether its battery is up to scratch, because there's going to be a rating scale for that. It's about putting in place the consumer protections that make people feel safe making these choices. And that comes from clear government guidance, but it also comes from great companies going out there, engaging with people as customers, and communities talking to each other. It comes from your neighbour saying how much they like their new heat pump or their underfloor heating or their EV. Just as we know that there is I think 6.5 percentage point increase in the likelihood that you will get solar panels for every solar panel you can see from your front door. And we know that cultural impact is really powerful. So the more people we have out there having positive experiences because they've got great consumer protection, the more people will go through this transition in a way that they feel happy about and in control of. And I think there's a whole bunch of things that have been really niche up until this point that are going to play an important role in that. And that includes things like community ownership of energy assets. Because if you were mining coal, they gave you coal as part of your comp. It was a huge part of your life. You lived near it, you saw it, everyone understood it. It caused a nightmare in cleaning terms in your home. You cooked on it, you heated with it. It was part of your life. And at the moment, electricity is something that happens with companies a long way away, who I'm afraid people are quite rude about a lot of the time. And that's not a great way of getting people on board, right? So we need to give people ownership of this, and that's by helping them understand it and making it, I will say once more, easy, cheap, and desirable.
Nice strapline to finish with there as well, Daisy. Thanks. And Dara, so we've got this issue around like where hydrogen sits in the system, and then also around the communication we need to have with people and how we make it as simple for them as possible. So maybe you can talk a little bit about like where industry is on this, but also kind of like what's needed more broadly as well.
Yeah, look, I think Daisy was spot on. We're going to need it for an awful lot in this country. I'm not convinced we're going to need it for home heating, but I am looking forward to more evidence on that in the 7th carbon budget. I think it's going to be really important to make a decision, draw a line under it, so that we can get on with producing lots of green hydrogen if we can, and using it for the right thing. There are some things that you cannot electrify or would be too expensive to electrify. And I think it is an important conversation to be had, because actually what sits alongside it is the conversation about decommissioning the gas grid. And I think that's something that we don't have enough of a conversation about either, and it's part of the same thing. So I think that's really, really important. It's a good question to ask. Not thinking that you should have an abundance of hydrogen for heating homes doesn't mean you don't think that there should be hydrogen, right? Like we will need hydrogen. It's part of the mix that this country will need. I think that there is something very interesting in the conversation about people. I think, again, agree with Daisy, but it is about outcomes for people. It is about warm, safe, comfortable homes. Switch the light on and you have light. Be able to cook. Be able to kind of wash your clothes and things like that. On the conversation about people, there's not much to add to what you said, other than actually it's just about making it easier to be part of people's lives. What I will say, to your point about the companies people don't like, they really don't like them. And It's a problem because actually the retailers are the ones who've got a connection with every single home and business in this country. They need to be at the forefront of delivering the transition to people's homes. They are the ones who have kept ECO going, which is the only energy efficiency scheme that actually has delivered and maintained a supply chain in this country. Love it or loathe it, it's worked when everything else has been stop-start and not done a good job. And the other thing I'd say about the retailers is that actually it's really hard to innovate when you're in the lowest margin bit of our entire industry. You know, over 4 years, just from COVID through the crisis, on average, I think the retailers lost about £4 billion. They're not profit making on the whole. Some of them have come into profit partly because of price cap changes. But ultimately, I think it is a problem. And it is a problem for us as an industry. But it's also a problem for government because you can't keep lambasting the very companies that you also need to deliver this transition. So we do need to have that conversation out in the open, and we need to improve trust and reputation. But likewise, we need to think about what's a level playing field for this industry. Are the regulations right? Are the way that we sort out and have the price cap does a very different job to what it was initially set out to do. Do we review it and think about how it's fit for purpose? And the last thing I'll say, Ned, is policy cost rebalancing is going to be important, as is targeted support for people. And if we don't get those two things right, then we could forget about taking people with us.
Yeah, absolutely right. We've got to get that cost part right before anything else, really. Otherwise, people won't be keen to make any of the switches we need them to do. Jess, come to you next. Again, sort of, where does hydrogen sit? I imagine you may have some similar opinions, but I mean, you can go through the sort of work you've done in that area, and also how we keep people on board, and the sort of the public opinion part of this.
Yeah, sure. So I agree. Hydrogen, I don't think is going to have a huge role, if any at all, in heating. I think we're better off keeping the hydrogen for the industries that actually need it, like steel making, cement, those heavy industries that can't decarbonise using electricity, or it'd be too expensive to do so. I do think the government should crack on with making a decision. I think the National Infrastructure Commission, Climate Change Committee, Energy Transitions Committee or Commission have all said that we should have a decision on hydrogen heating sooner rather than later, because it is just creating uncertainty. It's allowing vested interests to go into government and say that hydrogen's going to have a huge role when it's just not. And clearing that up, I think, can only be beneficial. On public consent and taking the public with us, it's interesting that you mentioned reform, because I don't think that many people who vote reform are actually voting for them based on the net zero or climate change promises. I think there was some polling from Persuasion UK around why people vote for reform, and it is overwhelmingly about immigration and other issues and not really about climate change. Net zero, I think we have to remember, net zero is not arbitrary. It was decided as the target by the IPCC because that's the only way in which we can reach 1.5/2 degrees. And we have to reach net zero by 2050 in order to be able to reach that. And I think it's quite sad to see the Conservative Party in particular moving towards moving towards an anti-net zero position, or a more anti-net zero position, based on what they're seeing from reform, because I just don't think the reality is people vote for them based on that. And I think net zero is overwhelmingly going to be a good thing. I do think there's work to do on taking people with us and clearly explaining that net zero is not going to be you're not allowed to drive your car, it's not going to be you're not allowed to fly anywhere, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think, a strong position from government on clearing up some of that and on hydrogen heating would be very useful.
Great, thanks, Jess. And finally, Andrew, you mentioned hydrogen a little bit earlier on, but perhaps you could sort of run through your sort of thoughts on that, and then finally, as the MP, you obviously have to think about public opinion more than anybody else on this panel. So perhaps you can talk about how you think about that side of things as well, given it's so important in this area.
Yeah, thanks. On hydrogen, it's incredible where the conversation has moved to in the short period that we've really been sort of focused on this. When I joined when the department was created, in February 2023, and I was given I had the pleasure of taking the energy bill then and then the Energy Act through Parliament. One of the biggest issues that we were grappling with was the hydrogen levy, the potential of the hydrogen levy, and whether or not that would be a thing or not, and indeed the discussion around whether or not hydrogen for heating would become a reality. At that point in February 2023, I think if you had spoken to any of the ministers involved, or indeed any of the officials involved in that discussion, the presumption was that yes, it would have a role to play. By the time that the British people decided that they needed a break from Conservative government in July, earlier this year, short break, in July this year, that conversation had moved quite significantly towards a feeling that it probably wouldn't have a role to play in domestic heating, but that it would have a significant role to play in industry and transportation. It has to be made, and it has to be made soon, because there is uncertainty out there. And for industry and indeed the general public, investors especially, we need to know what the direction of travel is. So whereas we probably should have made that decision prior to the election in July, I very much hope that this government will now bite the bullet and take a decision on where we are headed. My money would be, not that we're allowed to place any bets these days, would be on it not having a role in domestic heating, but having a significant role in other elements of the energy mix. What was the other question? Oh, public opinion. Right, okay, yeah, of course. Look, it's not that the Conservative Party is moving against net zero. We're very proud of having legislated for net zero. We're very proud of being the first G7 nation to have our carbon emissions. Very proud of having been in government when we built the first to fifth largest offshore wind farms in the world. Somebody mentioned tidal earlier. AR5, for as much as it was disappointing on offshore wind, actually was the first auction round to allocate money specifically towards the development of tidal and wave technologies. I've visited EMEC up in Orkney. They're doing incredible work. So it's not that we are against net zero or that we're moving away from that. But in the words of Rishi last September, we need to do that in a proportionate and pragmatic way, in a way that takes the British people with us and does not overburden them with higher bills. And I think the problem has been that the British people have been overpromised and under-delivered to over the past few years when it comes to net zero and climate policy overall. I mean, I'm not seeking to be political here at all, but I'm about to be. I mean, in the run-up to the election, it was repeated and repeated again that as a result of the creation of Great British Energy and indeed other policy decisions being taken by the Labour government, that people would see a reduction in their bills of £300 by 2030. Now, the current government have stopped saying that, and it's noticeable by its absence in every release from DESNZ and indeed every speech that Ed Miliband now makes, that is not being said. So people out there will rightly feel aggrieved if we get to 2030 and they're not seeing a reduction of £300 in the bills. Indeed, as of October and indeed in January, the price cap will see bills increasing, and that's not what the British people were promised. So governments, parties of both colours, have got to stop over-promising, and that's where we were moving towards, and that's where I think we are still moving towards when it comes to the net zero debate. I don't think people are voting, as Jess said, people are voting for reform because of their position on net zero, but people do feel that they're paying far too high a cost for energy right now, and they do feel, because we are not talking to them clearly enough and being honest with them, that is as a result of this push towards renewables. There is a concern that renewables at any cost at the expense of other technologies is going to have an impact, an adverse impact on bills, and that's why we have concerns as to the pace at which the current government are moving and the emphasis that the current government seems to have on renewables at the expense of other technologies. But that's not to say that we're abandoning net zero, nor is it to say that the British public overwhelmingly do not still support a move towards a cleaner environment and indeed net zero in the long run. But we need to be much more pragmatic and proportionate in how we get there than I'm afraid that the current government is being right now. And that's where we were driving towards, and that's where I think the policy discussion is going to be moving towards still further within the Conservative Party, and indeed when we get back into power in 4 years. That's where we'll be.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's been a fascinating, very wide-ranging discussion. That's even included the relative popularity of net zero and Beyonce. So all that's left for me to do is to say thank you very much to you in the audience for joining us. And if you could please join me in giving a round of applause to our fantastic panel.